Well, good morning and welcome to Sunday Coffee with Dr. Childress. This Sunday coffee is actually occurring on Monday because I was a little under the weather and slept all day yesterday, which was very productive. I do a lot of seemingly thinking in my sleep with my dreams, and yesterday was particularly productive. And that's what I'm going to be discussing today. Is we are shifting from one phase of your treatment plan, and you probably don't even know you have a treatment plan, but we're shifting from phase one to phase two at this point. So I'm going to be adopting a bit of a different role, uh, a more active role in things going forward. And so this is essentially point zero on a new line that's opening relative to your treatment. And phase two, it's a new bullet point. I'll explain all of that. But essentially, what I'm going to be focusing on from here on out will be the DSM-5 diagnosis of a factitious disorder imposed on another, FDIA. That's a DSM 300.19. And the pathology in the family courts is that pathology, the factitious disorder. It's a false attachment pathology being imposed on the child for secondary gain to the allied narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. That's the DSM-5 diagnosis. So let's talk about, let me just set the ground information that we're going to be standing on from here going forward. And that's the DSM-5. Okay, so the alternative diagnostic system is the ICD-11. And so we're going to be grounding ourselves on those diagnostic systems. Now, the difference is the DSM-5 comes out of the American Psychiatric Association and talks about all psychiatric disorders and provides some additional information about each disorder, from their causes to associated features, those sorts of things. The ICD-11 is from the World Health Organization, and it provides a diagnostic code number for all medical and all psychiatric disorders. So that's used in billing. So for something like all insurance billing uses the ICD-11 code numbers. If for medical disorders, if you go in for heart surgery, they have a little code number. If you have high blood pressure, they got a little code number for the treatment. If you have ADHD, there's a code ICD-11 code number and various things. And so those two diagnostic systems basically line up. And factitious disorder imposed on another is in both of them. So it's the same pathology here that we're talking about, a factitious disorder imposed on another. And those are the established diagnostic systems. So diagnosis guides treatment. We need a treatment plan. So we're going to be returning to those diagnostic systems. Now, that's kind of weird that we're returning to baseline professional standards of practice. So we're climbing out of the cellar of professional practices back up to just baseline diagnosis, because we need a diagnosis and treatment. Because the PAS experts, parental alienation center, went below. They stopped using the DSM ICD-11 and started making up new pathology they thought they were discovering. No, they're not discovering it. They just failed to apply the established knowledge, which is kind of crazy. We'll talk about that. Everybody's been trying to prove parental alienation is or trying to get the parental alienation into the DSM or get them to acknowledge it. And they're saying, you're not in the pathology's been in the DSM-5 all the entire time, DSM-4 as well. It's been there the entire time, if anybody looks. But nobody looked. If you ask, people are off saying we're discovering something new. No, they're not. It's in the DSM-5. And the established psychology says there's no parental alienation. It's not in the DSM. Yeah, it is. It's right over factitious disorder imposed on another. Nobody's looking. Okay, so I'll explain it to you, and that's where we're headed. We're headed back to established knowledge. So first off, let's take a look at the ICD-11 definition of a factitious disorder imposed on another. So there's two parts to this ICD-11 definition of what a factitious disorder imposed on another is. And classically, it's called Munchausen by proxy. So it says, a factitious disorder imposed on another is characterized by feigning, falsifying, or inducing medical, psychological, or behavioral signs and symptoms or injury in another person, most commonly a child dependent associated with identified deception. So then when we apply that to the family court pathology, what we have for that first clause is that the allied parent is inducing psychological and behavioral signs and symptoms, check mark, okay, in a dependent child, check mark, to deceive the court, check mark, regarding the normal range parenting of the targeted parents for secondary gain to that parent. Okay. The secondary gain to the allied narcissistic borderline dark personality parent, there's three of them. One is manipulating the court's decisions related to the child custody. The second reward that the pathological parent gets for creating false pathology is the spousal emotional and psychological abuse of the targeted parent, using the child as the weapon. And then the third secondary gain or reward for the pathological parent to create attachment pathology, false attachment pathology in the child, is to use the child as a regulatory object to meet that parent's own emotional and psychological needs. So clause 1 of the ICD-11 diagnostic criteria is met. We have induced behavioral signs and symptoms, psychological signs and symptoms of an attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent, to deceive the court and deceive mental health people about the nature of the normal range parenting of the targeted parent. And they're deceiving everybody like it's abusive range because of the child's induced symptoms. Okay, so now here's the second part of that ICD-11 criteria. The individual seeks treatment for the other person or otherwise presents him or her as ill, injured, or impaired based on feigned, falsified, or induced signs, symptoms, or injuries. So when we apply that, we have the allied parent presents the child to the court and to mental health professionals as having been injured by the parenting of the targeted parent and as impaired in the child's relationship with the targeted parent based on the induced signs and symptoms. Okay, so there it is. There's your factitious attachment pathology imposed on a child for secondary gain to the allied parent. Now, based on my resume, you can look at my resume. I was trained at Children's Hospitals of Los Angeles. I was on medical staff as a pediatric psychologist on Children's Hospitals Los Angeles, Orange County, and that's where FDIA shows up, is in children's hospitals. And it's, so I have experience and I know what I'm talking about with FDIA. This is a factitious attachment pathology being imposed on the child by a narcissistic borderline dark personality parent for secondary gain to that parent. That's the DSM-5 diagnosis. So that then becomes child psychological abuse, because creating a shared or induced persecutory thought disorder in the child and a false factitious attachment pathology, factitious disorder imposed on another, for the secondary gain to the pathological parent represents a DSM-5 diagnosis of child psychological abuse. Okay, so we're moving through step by step here, that the symptoms meet diagnostic criteria for a factitious disorder imposed on another, false attachment pathology for secondary gain to the parent. the creation of a persecutory thought disorder, DSM-5 297.1, and a factitious disorder imposed on the child, 300.19, represents a DSM-5 diagnosis of child psychological abuse, V995.51. Okay, so it's already in the DSM-5 if we apply the DSM-5. However, if you leave the world of professional practice for some reason and stop applying the DSM-5 to your diagnostic formulations and decision making, then you will misdiagnose the pathology because you're not applying established knowledge, the DSM diagnostic system. And so that's just a fact. So when the PAS experts, Gardner and Burnett and everybody, left the field and started making up new pathology that they think they're discovering, they stopped applying the DSM-5. And so then they begin misdiagnosing the pathology because it's in the DSM-5. So they're not making the diagnosis of factitious disorder or child psychological abuse. That's a problem. We got duty to protect obligations. So they are practicing below misdiagnosis. That we know they've misdiagnosed the pathology because they're not giving any DSM-5 diagnosis. So we know, so they would have to improve their professional practices to reach the level of misdiagnosis. We're not even talking about accurate diagnosis yet. We're just talking about them reaching the level of a misdiagnosis. They would have to get better because they've left the whole diagnostic system. Now, the forensic psychologists, the custody evaluators, did exactly the same thing. They left diagnosing pathology because they're in this new quasi-judicial role for doctors, that we're helping the court decide on custody. We're not here to pathologize parents. So they're not diagnosing either. They're not applying the diagnostic criteria, and they're not providing a DSM diagnosis in their custody evaluations. So they would need to improve the quality of professional practices to reach the level of misdiagnosis, to reach the ground. They're going to have to crawl out of the hole, professional hole we're in, of just making stuff up. One group makes up a new form of pathology supposedly unique to the family courts. It doesn't exist anywhere else. No, that's not true. It exists all over the place. We got narcissistic borderline darks all over the place. They're just showing up in the family courts because of the divorce and attachment pathology. It's not a new pathology somebody's discovering. They're just too lazy to look in the DSM-5, factitious disorder imposed on another, shared persecutory delusion, child psychological abuse. And the forensic psychologists made up this new role for doctors. Doctors have never been in a quasi-judicial role. We've always remained doctors, diagnose and treat pathology, but they left for this new role. And they say as much. They say, we're not doing clinical psychology. It's a bad way to do things. We're new and objective. We're in this quasi-judicial role of helping the court. They say that. They say they left. And when they do that, you're going to misdiagnose the pathology. And they're going to misdiagnose child abuse, which is pretty bad. Okay. And if you believe a shared delusion, then you become part of the child abuse, which is like really, really bad for the psychologist to be part of the child abuse. But they are. I read the reports. And so here's your DSM-5 diagnosis. Okay. So for the allied parent, it's 297.1 delusional disorder, shared persecutory type. 300.19 FDIA, factitious attachment pathology, 995.51 child psychological abuse, and you put a rule out on that of spouse or partner abuse, psychological. So there's your DSM-5 diagnosis. So for all you parents who for all this time have been trying to argue and that we should get this into the DSM-5 and we need to promote this to the APA and convince people and stuff, and for all you critics who's saying that the pathology is not in the DSM-5 and so it doesn't exist, for all of you, I want you to kind of settle in and understand, yes, it is in the DSM-5. Okay, and it's been there this entire time. You just haven't looked because you've been fighting and fighting and fighting. Why? Because of this parental alienation stuff. That took everybody off track. Instead of applying knowledge, they took everybody off to these made up pathologies, and then we get arguing about whether or not there's parental alienation rather than that. It's like, you folks, you PAS experts, self-proclaimed experts, did a very bad thing. Go back to established knowledge. Go back to applying the DSM-5, please, so we can get a solution to this and stop fighting about your belief system that you're discovering some sort of new pathology. No, you're not. Please apply the DSM-5. For you forensic psychologists, your model failed. Your quasi-experimental role, New York Blue Ribbon Commission, it's harmful to children, lacks scientific and legal value, and it should be entirely eliminated from the family courts. Absolutely right. We need to go back to diagnosis and treatment, please. We need to fix the problem, and to fix the problem, we need a diagnosis of what the problem is. Are we treating cancer or diabetes? So we're going to need a DSM-5 diagnosis all the time, because I'm going to say you're misdiagnosing the pathology. So now you have to defend your diagnosis because I'm saying it's a factitious disorder. You need to now tell me why it's an authentic attachment disorder being caused by child abuse by the targeted parent, because I'm saying you're misdiagnosing factitious disorder. So defend your diagnosis, but you don't have a you don't have a diagnosis yet. So you're going to have to improve the quality of your professional practices to reach the level where we can clearly identify you're misdiagnosing the pathology. So you're going to have to improve to the level of misdiagnosis before we can improve the overall system to get an accurate diagnosis. We're going to have to get back to the DSM-5 and ICD-11 diagnostic systems. That's just a fact. If you want to solve this, you're going to have to identify what the problem is. That's a diagnosis, and so you apply the established diagnostic criteria. It's factitious disorder imposed on another, child psychological abuse. So the second part of what I'm talking about here today. So that's going to be the first part. We got the DSM-5 diagnosis. We need to return to applying that. That's a factitious disorder. It's child psychological abuse. So let's do that, please. Now, the second part is you may not realize, but you're on a treatment plan. Okay, so all you parents out there, the family courts and the mental health people and Gardner's PAS experts and forensic psychologists, AFCC, you don't realize it, but I have you on a treatment plan to fix your systems. The reason is I'm a clinical psychologist. That's what I do. I put people on treatment plans. I diagnose the problem and develop a treatment plan for it. That's my career. That's what I do. That's what I'm good at. If I was a car mechanic, I'd fix your car. If I was a plumber, I'd fix your sink. I'm not. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a doctor. I diagnose and treat pathology. So I have you on a treatment plan. Okay, so I'm going to describe what the treatment plan is and where we're at with that right now. So the first phase 1 of the treatment plan was to educate people on the pathology, attachment family systems, DSM-5. Okay, so that's what I've been doing. I've been educating everybody about the pathology. Now, phase 2 is transitioning to the DSM-5 diagnosis. Once I've educated you about what the pathology is, then we will transition back to applying the diagnostic systems and accurately diagnose what the pathology is. FDIA, shared persecutory delusion, child psychological abuse. See how that works? Okay, first you learn what it is, and then we're going to apply the DSM criteria. Now, on your treatment plan, you have a barrier to treatment. That's what they're called. And in this case, it's the forensic psychologist. Now, notice on that line, though, so it's under the bullet point. Your barrier to treatment is under the bullet point of phase 2. Okay, that when we try to transition to the DSM-5, there will be a barrier to treatment. That's the forensic psychologists who don't want to do that because they will lose their career. So what do we do about the barrier to treatment? Put it on a treatment plan. So that you'll see the bullet point under that regarding standards 2.04, 2.01, 9.01, and duty to protect. So those are the way we're going to leverage the forensic psychologists, and their barrier is they are unethical, violation 2.04, 2.01, 9.01, and failure and duty to protect. Okay, so we're now going to leverage that to force them to apply the DSM-5 and the established knowledge, or else face licensing board complaints because of. So that's how we're dealing with the barrier to treatment of the forensic psychologists. Okay, so we're at phase 2 now, where we're transitioning out of phase 1 into phase 2, where we're going to be applying the DSM-5 and ICD-11 finally, but we're going to have barrier to treatment from the forensic. We got a little barrier on the PAS experts, but they're not relevant. Okay, it's the forensic psychologists who own you and control you, and they're the ones who are going to be leaving. Okay, and they don't want to leave, and so that's going to be the next barrier to treatment issue. So you can see that phase 1 is done. I'm done educating everybody. Okay, I started off with the attachment system and family systems and shared persecutory delusion, and I did all of that. And the reason I did that, by the way, I started with the persecutory delusion because I started with the DSM-4 when that was active, and it was in the DSM-4, a shared psychotic disorder. So the shared persecutory delusion was in the DSM-4 this entire time. Okay, all your mental health people from the 80s to 2013 whiffed entirely because no one applied the DSM-5 or 4. So I did. That's what I brought out, persecutory delusion. Plus, it's very identifiable. You can do a mental status exam and pop it out and get the delusional disorder. Okay, factitious disorder is a diagnosis by rule out. Okay, so there's nothing there. So it's a little harder to diagnose, a little bit more sophisticated. But a delusional disorder, you can pop that out and see that in the clinical interview. So that's why I started with the persecutory delusion. But then in 2013, the DSM-5 came out and they took that shared psychotic disorder away. It's no longer because they don't like shared disorders. So they took out the shared psychotic disorder, but they added a psychological child abuse. Well, there you go. Now a shared psychotic disorder is still there. It's under delusional disorder, and then it's a qualifier, shared or induced. And so, but it's a little harder to get at diagnostically. You have to diagnose the parent first and then get the child, as opposed to diagnosing just up from the child. Technical issues. But so at the DSM-5, when that came out, then I shifted over to the child psychological abuse diagnosis, because that's exactly the diagnosis we need. And the way we get to that is shared delusional disorder and false factitious attachment pathology. And the FDIA is still in the DSM-5. And that's actually spot on what this pathology is. It's a false attachment pathology imposed on the child for secondary gain to the parent. Spot on of FDIA. But FDIA is going to be an unfamiliar diagnosis to almost every psychologist. It's a very rare kind of thing, except in the family courts. It's really, really common. The reason it's so common in the family courts is because you reward it. If the parent produces factitious attachment pathology in the child, you give them the child. Well, if you're going to reward a behavior, they're going to find the behavior. And you got narcissistic borderline dark personalities, and you're rewarding them creating pathology in the child. Guess what? You're going to see a lot of that pathology in the family courts. So that's why you have the elevation relative to the regular population, is because the family courts are rewarding the creation of false pathology in the child by pathological parents. So stop doing that, please. So So then I shifted over to factitious disorder, and I've been educating you about that, and I'm still educating you about family systems and attachment. And attachment. There's only we have to. It's a it's a goal-corrected system. It always maintains the goal. So if the child's flipping over and rejecting a parent, there's only the cause of that is child abuse. That's the only cause of a directional change in attachment bonding. So let's get a proper diagnosis for child abuse to which parent. So that's what I've been educating you about up till now is differential diagnoses, and this could be child abuse by either parent, so we need to get a proper assessment. Notice we haven't got one in the family courts. I can educate you, but unless you do it, okay, there's going to be child abuse. So you got child abuse one way or the other. We need to get a proper risk assessment every single time. And that's going to be phase 2 once we start applying the DSM-5. And so, I've educated you now. And pretty much I'm done educating you. So that's done. So now we're at phase 2, transitioning to the DSM-5, FDIA, shared persecutory delusion, psychological child abuse with the barrier of the forensic psychologist. That's exactly spot on right now where we are in your treatment plan. We're in phase 2 down at the barrier to treatment, the forensic psychologists and the ethics code duty to protect. So here's the situation, and here's where the transition, here's point 0, is we are currently in the cover-up and conflict of interest phase of your treatment plan. So we are now in the cover-up phase by the forensic psychologists, the barriers to treatment, who are intentionally covering up their failure with their quasi-judicial role and their forensic custody evaluations, and who are intentionally disabling the mental health system response to the pathology, which is a return to DSM-5 diagnoses and treatment for their own financial and career status gain. Okay, that's important. If we return and start applying the DSM-5 and say it's a factitious disorder and child psychological abuse, that means all the forensic custody evaluators for the past 40 years have misdiagnosed the factitious disorder and child abuse. If we start doing it now, that means they didn't do it before. Okay, so now we're in a situation where we can't diagnose the child abuse now because that'll admit that they didn't do it before. And they then need to leave because they've had demonstrated 40 years of incompetence and their failed quasi-judicial experiment they did on parents, complete failure. And we're going to have to acknowledge that their forensic custody evaluations are a failed model of service delivery, and that they've incompetent and misdiagnosed the pathology as a result of their failed experiment. They need to leave. Okay, so the top forensic people need to go, and you can name them. I can name them. They have names. There are forensic psychologists with names who are intentionally disabling the mental health system response to the family courts for their own financial and career status gains. I can name them. You can name them. Just look at the top tier of forensic psychologists. All of the ones, them. That's who has the financial interests in maintaining their forensic custody evaluations and not diagnosing the factitious disorder, which leads to that second concern, the conflict of interest that now exists in the forensic psychologists. There is a tremendous conflict of interest in the forensic psychologists in the family courts between what's needed, which is the diagnosis and treatment plan to fix things, and their own personal gain. Because the moment we start doing that, they don't know how to diagnose factitious disorder. They don't know how to diagnose persecutory delusions, and they haven't been. They just need to leave, and we need to get a higher quality mental health person in there. But they don't want to leave. That's their car payment and house payment. So here's phase 3, just so you're aware. of what we're headed into. Phase 3 will actually be once we transition over to the back to the DSM-5 diagnostic system and established healthcare principles. Then we're going to have the solution that the DSM-5 is adopted as the basis for professional judgments. Yay! Okay, we finally got back to using the DSM-5 as a basis for diagnostic judgments. All right, so once we do that, the forensic custody evaluators will need to leave. We need to end them. There is no quasi-judicial role for doctors. It's a failed experiment. And all the forensic custody evaluators need to leave for their abject failure and collusion with the child abuse for 40 years. So they don't know what it is, so bye. You can all leave and we'll get some people in who actually care and are responsible and professional about what they do. And so we will be starting to routinely conduct a proper risk assessment for child abuse when warranted by the symptoms and context. Yay! Okay, so we got child rejecting a parent. Let's get a proper risk assessment for child abuse to the differential diagnosis, please. And when child abuse is present, protect the child. That's what we need to start doing all the time. Okay. So, and then we move into phase 4. And phase 4 is going to be interesting because that's the developing capacity. Because right now, you don't have any competent mental health people in the family courts. Okay, nobody's competent, because you hear anybody saying, hey, this is the factitious disorder. Hey, this is attachment pathology and child abuse. Anybody else saying that? No. Okay, because you don't have anybody competent. I know, because I know where you get competent in delusional thought disorders, and none of them have it, because I did. I know because I know where you get competent in attachment pathology, and none of them have it, because I did. Okay, so I know they're not competent, and I can see it because they're not diagnosing and effectively treating the pathology. So I know they're not competent. There's only 2 causes of treatment failure. Either you've misdiagnosed the pathology and you're treating cancer with insulin, or you're incompetent in the treatment for that pathology, because if you've accurately diagnosed the problem and you are competent in your treatment of that problem, then the problem is going to be solved. Okay, so the only cause of treatment failure is either you've misdiagnosed it or you're not competent, or both, and they're both. So now here's the situation with the education. Once we switch over to the DSM diagnosis and get rid of these forensic custody, everybody's going to acknowledge that I'm right. Okay, Dr. Childress is right. It's a FDIA, it's a shared delusion, it's child psychological abuse, and I have been right this entire time for 10 years saying exactly the same thing. And everybody's going to say, you know what? Dr. Childress is right. That means you will start listening to Dr. Childress and doing what Dr. Childress recommends you do, because you acknowledge I'm right. And I recommend that you start by collecting a simple diagnostic checklist: 3 symptoms, check, 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 and 12 associated clinical signs. I think those are helpful. And the parenting practices rating scale. Just document what that targeted parent's parenting is. Between those 2 instruments, if you do that, if you collect just simple checklists of symptoms, the diagnostic checklist for pathogenic parenting, 12 associated clinical signs, and the parenting practices rating scale, if you do that, you will accurately diagnose the pathology 100% of the time. Okay, try it, and you'll see. Okay, but you'll get there. We'll get there simply because we'll start applying the DSM-5, and everybody will eventually say, Dr. Childress is right about this. And at that point, you can start doing the checklist, and you'll solve everything. And I recommend that you apply the parent-child relationship rating scale as your outcome measure. Start rating the child every day by the targeted parent on 3 symptoms: affection, cooperation, social involvement, on a 7-point Likert scale. Email that to your family therapist. Okay, that's like standard clinical psychology, please. Okay, so let's get back to established psychology, diagnosis and treatment, outcome measures, treatment plans, things like that. And we will absolutely fix the pathology. Easy peasy. Okay, this is so easy. And here's where we're headed there at that point, is that there's two litigants. Each litigant is accusing the other one of child abuse. So let's get a clinical diagnostic assessment for the child abuse concerns involved. It's going to be a disputed diagnosis because it's the legal system. We know that. So let's get a second opinion right at the start to end the fighting about that. You know what? Let's get a third opinion if we need it. So allow each litigant to appoint their own second opinion through telehealth. We can do that. Look at this, the internet. 21st century. So we can get second opinion on telehealth, consultation, and I guarantee you, if you have three doctors on an assessment, you're going to get the court really good information. And so, and each party can appoint their own. And so that's your solution. You get the court decision that goes into the treatment plan. And what that will look like as you move it into the treatment plan, as the whole thing is, that's what it's going to look like. You're going to have the court that's going to have this custody decision that involves child pathology. They're going to say, hey, you know what? I got two litigants, each making child abuse allegations against the other. Let's get a diagnostic assessment of what's going on in the family. Two litigants who can each point their own second opinion by telehealth. Once we get a diagnosis, that goes back into the court for its decision-making as well as guiding the treatment plan. And then you have two consultants who are available to the treatment provider to provide consultation on the treatment going forward because they were at the assessment when it was diagnosed. Okay, so that's your solution right there. Okay, whenever folks want a solution, go back to the DSM-5, go back to established healthcare, do it, and listen to what Dr. Childress is saying, because I'm telling you what the solution is. As long as you want to fight and fight and fight and have no solution and chaos in the family courts and what are we going to do? You can do that as long as you want. Okay. The solution is very, very simple. DSM-5, apply the diagnostic criteria, DSM-5 ICD-11. Okay, apply the diagnose what the problem is, put it on a treatment plan. It's really, really simple. Okay, but the concern is child abuse by one parent or the other. Okay, the concern is not parental alienation. The concern is not resist-refuse dynamic. The concern is not parent-child contact problems. Those are all made-up euphemisms. Okay, the concern is child abuse by a narcissistic, borderline, dark personality parent who's inducing false, factitious attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain to that parent, of manipulating the court's decisions on child custody, of spousal abuse against the ex-spouse targeted parent, and of meeting their own emotional and psychological needs using the child as a regulatory object for them. Okay, so that's what the pathology is, and I've explained it. Now, if I have to explain it to the doctors, that means they're not competent by demonstrated need to have this explained to them. Okay, so they're not competent. Right now, I know that because they're having to be educated about what this is, and I'm having to educate them. Now, you as parents, you know what the pathology is. You know it's a factitious disorder. You know it's a child psychology. So you can take them in, and you got the ICD-11 criteria. So you can give them the ICD-11 criteria and say, you know, it's a factitious disorder, like Dr. Childress is saying. And tell me why. Defend your diagnosis as to why it's not a false attachment, why it's a true attachment pathology being caused by me. So defend your diagnosis. Am I abusive of the parent? There's your parenting practices rating scale. Now fill it out. Show me where on this scale, parenting practice rate, where I'm abusive. Show me, document it. Am I level 3 or 4? Then I'm not causing the abuse because I'm a normal range parent. Right? And so it's not an authentic attachment pathology. It's a false attachment, a factitious disorder, which is child psychological abuse. If you have to explain the pathology to the doctor, that doctor is not competent based on the demonstrated need to have a patient explain the pathology to them. Okay. That's just a fact. And that's where we are right now. So realize that. You're going in and explaining the pathology to the doctor. They're not confident. That's how bad things are. Where are the licensing boards? My goodness gracious. Nowhere to be seen. Why is that? Why do we have patients explaining the pathology to the doctors and the licensing boards are nowhere to be seen? Curious. Now, if Dr. Childress has to explain the pathology to them, they're not competent by the demonstrated need to have me explain the pathology to them. That's how bad things are. Okay. So they're kind of stuck right now. If they acknowledge that it's FDIA, then they acknowledge they need to be educated, and they're not. And they're all the previous. And if they don't, then they disable the mental health system response of applying the DSM-5 and diagnosing the child abuse. It's a tough time right now. So we're in the cover-up phase, we're in the conflict of interest phase, and then once that resolves, we'll move into the phase 3, applying the DSM-5, get the solution. Phase 4, people start listening to me, start doing what I do, and you'll have absolutely the solution right here. Okay, right there, the moment you want it. And we're building capacity because I'll be consulting on these cases, and I'll be helping people develop their capacity to accurately diagnose FDIA and shared delusions. So with that, that's my Sunday coffee on the situation. So we'll be moving into phase 2 with the cover-up, with the barrier to treatment that's currently present. And then we'll see what happens with the forensic psychologists and AFCC and APA and CAFCAS and everybody else who cares. So we'll talk to you later. Good luck, everybody out there. It's a pretty low caliber of mental health people you have in the family courts. So with that, bye-bye.